Before we dive into tonight's tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you want more creepy stories that will keep you up at night. My name is Elias. I never thought I'd end up working the night shift at some rundown pharmacy in the middle of nowhere, Nevada. But here's the thing. When you owe a gambling debt so big that the people you owe start making offers you can't refuse, you take whatever job you can get. And I mean whatever. So when the previous pharmacist, old Mr. Abernathy, had a stroke, or at least that's what they told me, I stepped in. Desperate times, right? The place was called Desert Bloom Pharmacy. It sounded quaint, almost charming, but trust me, it wasn't. The building was this faded, sandblasted structure that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the 70s. Inside, it was all fluorescent lights and the faint smell of antiseptic that never quite masked the underlying stench of something off. I can't even describe it. It was like the air itself was tired, heavy, like it had been holding its breath for decades. My manager was a woman named Miss Hoover. She was gaunt, with this hollowed-out look in her eyes, like she hadn't slept properly in years. Her voice was raspy, like she'd been chain-smoking since birth, and she had this way of talking to you without ever actually looking at you. It was unnerving, but I figured she was just one of those people who'd been worn down by life. During my training, if you could even call it that, she handed me this laminated sheet of paper. It was creased and yellowed, like it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. "These are the operational guidelines," she said, her voice low and gravely. "Follow them precisely. No exceptions." I remember holding it in my hands, feeling the weight of her words, but at the time, I just thought it was some corporate nonsense. You know, the usual, don't steal from the register kind of stuff. I scoffed internally, thinking, how bad could it be? But then I flipped it over. The rules were handwritten in this faded, spidery ink on the back of an old prescription form. The front had Mr. Abernathy's signature, dated 1967. That alone gave me pause. Why were the rules handwritten? And why were they on the back of a prescription form that was over 50 years old? It felt wrong, like I was holding something I wasn't supposed to see. But Miss Hoover didn't give me time to think about it. She just walked away, leaving me standing there with that sheet in my hands and a sinking feeling in my gut. Now let me tell you about the rules. These weren't your typical workplace guidelines. No, these were something else entirely. I'll list them out for you, just like they were written. Rule 1, the register never lies. Rule 2, always count the pills in prescription refills, even if the machine says it's correct. Rule 3, never speak to anyone who isn't on the schedule. Rule 4, if the lights flicker, hum a children's song until they stop. Rule 5, empty oxygen tanks are stored in the back room. No one should hear them. Rule 6, if a customer asks for Abernathy's special, say it's out of stock and offer an alternative. Rule 7, at 3:17 a.m., check the security feed of aisle 7 and note any changes. At first glance, they seemed random, almost nonsensical. But as I read them over and over, I started to notice little details that made my skin crawl. The way the ink was faded in some places, like someone had tried to erase or rewrite parts of it. The faint smudges that looked like fingerprints, as if countless hands had held this same sheet before me. And the tone, it wasn't just a list of rules. It was a warning. I didn't know it then, but those rules were the only thing keeping me alive during my time at Desert Bloom Pharmacy. And breaking even one of them, well, let's just say I learned the hard way why they were so important. It was my second week on the job, and I was starting to get into the rhythm of things. The nights were long and quiet, broken only by the occasional customer or the hum of the fluorescent lights. I'd already memorized the rules, though I still didn't fully understand them. Rule 1, in particular, seemed straightforward enough. The register never lies. I figured it was just a fancy way of saying, don't steal from the till. But I was about to learn how wrong I was. It was around midnight when the bell above the door jingled, pulling me out of my boredom. I looked up and saw a man shuffling in. He was disheveled, his clothes hanging off him like they were 2 sizes too big, and he reeked of gasoline and desperation. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and he had this wild look about him, like he hadn't slept in days. He made a beeline for the counter, his movements jerky and unsteady. "Cough syrup," he muttered, his voice raspy and low. "I need cough syrup." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Sure thing. Let me grab that for you." I turned to the shelf behind me and pulled out a bottle of the store brand stuff. When I turned back, he was leaning heavily on the counter, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. I scanned the bottle and waited for the register to pop open. That's when things got weird. The register showed he owed $5, but when I looked at the crumpled bill he'd slapped on the counter, it was only a single dollar. I frowned, picking it up and holding it to the light. It was definitely a $1 bill, worn and tattered, but unmistakable. Sir," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "The total is $5. You only gave me $1." He didn't respond at first. He just stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. Then, in a voice that sent a chill down my spine, he said, "The register says I have $5. I blinked, taken aback. "Yeah, but you only gave me $1, see?" I held up the bill as if that would somehow make him understand. He didn't budge. "The register never lies." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind flashed back to the laminated sheet to Rule 1. The register never lies. I glanced at the register again, then back at the man. He was still staring at me, his expression unreadable. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the way he said it, like it was some kind of mantra. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, like he knew something I didn't. Whatever it was, I handed him the cough syrup. He snatched it from my hand, muttered something under his breath, and shuffled out the door without another word. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where he'd been. My heart was pounding, though I couldn't quite explain why. Something about the whole interaction felt off. But I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was just a homeless guy, after all. What harm could he do? I found out the next morning. I was flipping through the local news on my phone when I saw the headline, "Gas Station Explosion Leaves 1 Dead." My stomach dropped as I read the article. The gas station on the edge of town had gone up in flames around 2 a.m. The fire had been so intense that it took hours for the firefighters to put it out. And the man who'd caused it, a homeless guy who'd been seen loitering around the station earlier that night, was presumed dead. My hands were shaking as I put my phone down. I kept thinking about the man who'd come into the pharmacy, the way he'd smelled like gasoline, the way he'd insisted the register never lied. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd somehow played a part in what happened. That was the first time I realized the rules weren't just guidelines. They were warnings, and breaking them, even unintentionally, came with consequences. It was one of those slow nights where the hours dragged on like molasses. The kind of night where you start noticing every little sound, the hum of the refrigerators, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights, the occasional creak of the building settling. I was in aisle 3, restocking shelves with bottles of multivitamins, trying to keep myself busy. The monotony was almost comforting in a way. Almost. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just a faint thud, like something heavy being dropped. I froze, my hand hovering over the shelf, and listened. For a moment, there was nothing. Then it came again, a dull, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps. But not just any footsteps. These were heavy, dragging, like someone was struggling to walk, and they were coming from above me. I straightened up slowly, my heart starting to pound. The Desert Bloom Pharmacy was a single-story building. I'd walked around it enough times to know that. There was no second floor, but the footsteps were unmistakable. They were directly overhead, moving across the ceiling in a slow, deliberate pattern. I could hear the creak of floorboards, or whatever was up there, groaning under the weight. My eyes darted to the ceiling tiles. They were trembling, just slightly, like they were being pressed down from above. A fine layer of dust drifted down, catching the light as it fell. I took a step back, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. There was no second floor. There couldn't be. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stood there frozen, staring at the ceiling, half expecting something to come crashing through, but nothing happened. The pharmacy was eerily quiet again, save for the hum of the lights. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and dialed Miss Hoover's number. She picked up on the third ring, her voice raspy and impatient. "What is it, Elias?" "Miss Hoover," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think there's someone in the building. I heard footsteps, above me, on the ceiling." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and measured, but there was something in it, something that made my blood run cold. "Elias, this building doesn't have a second floor." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell her I wasn't imagining things, but she hung up before I could say another word. I stared at my phone, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light, and then back up at the ceiling. The tiles were still now, the dust settled, but the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, lingered. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a broom leaning against the shelf, and held it like a weapon, my knuckles white. I didn't know what I was expecting to do with it, but it made me feel slightly less vulnerable. I crept toward the back of the store, my eyes darting around, scanning every shadow. The pharmacy felt different now, like the walls were closing in, the air thicker, harder to breathe. When I reached the back room, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Maybe it was the building settling, maybe it was pipes rattling, but deep down, I knew better. Those were footsteps, and they weren't human. I spent the rest of the night in the back room, jumping at every sound, my nerves frayed. When the sun finally rose and my shift ended, I practically ran out of the building. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still up there, waiting. After the incident with the footsteps above the pharmacy, I was on edge. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. I spent the next few nights hyper-aware, constantly glancing at the ceiling or the security monitors, half expecting something to happen. But nothing did. Then came the night of the sleeping pills. It was one of those eerily quiet shifts, the kind where the silence feels heavy and the air seems to hum with something you can't quite put your finger on. I was behind the counter, refilling prescriptions to keep myself busy. The machine spat out a bottle of sleeping pills, and I glanced at the label. It was for a regular customer, someone who came in every month like clockwork. The machine said there were 30 pills in the bottle. Simple enough. But Rule 2 was clear. Always count the pills in prescription refills, even if the machine says it's correct. At first, I'd thought it was just a redundant safety measure, something to cover the pharmacy's back in case of a lawsuit. But after the incident with the homeless man and the register, I wasn't taking any chances. I poured the pills out onto the counter and started counting. 1, 2, 3. I moved methodically, my fingers pushing each pill into a neat little row. When I got to 29, I stopped. There was no 30th pill. I frowned, glancing at the machine. It had clearly printed 30 on the label. Maybe I'd miscounted. I scooped the pills back into the bottle and started over. 1, 2, 3, again, 29. My stomach twisted. This wasn't right. I crouched down, checking the floor around the counter, and that's when I saw it. A single pill, crushed into powder as if someone had stepped on it. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly. The pill was flattened, the imprint of a shoe sole faintly visible in the powder. But how? I hadn't dropped any pills. I was sure of it. I stood there for a moment, staring at the crushed pill in my hand, trying to make sense of it. The air felt colder suddenly, like a draft had crept in from somewhere. I shook it off, telling myself it was just a mistake. Maybe the pill had fallen earlier and I hadn't noticed. I cleaned up the mess, filled out the prescription with the 29 pills, and handed it off to the customer when they came in later that night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, I heard the news. The patient who'd picked up the sleeping pills had been rushed to the hospital after a near-fatal overdose. According to the report, they'd taken the entire bottle at once. But that didn't make sense. There were only 29 pills, not enough to cause an overdose, at least not for someone with a tolerance. And yet, there it was, splashed across the local news. Local man hospitalized after overdose on prescription medication. I felt sick. My mind kept going back to that crushed pill, the way it had appeared out of nowhere, like it had been placed there deliberately. And then there was Rule 2, always count the pills. I'd followed it, but it hadn't mattered. Something or someone had intervened. That night, I found myself staring at the laminated sheet of rules, my hands shaking. The faded ink seemed to glare back at me, accusingly. I'd followed the rules, but the rules hadn't protected me. If anything, they'd pulled me deeper into whatever was happening at Desert Bloom Pharmacy. And I was starting to realize that I wasn't just an employee. I was a participant. The days were blurring together. Every shift felt heavier, like the walls of the pharmacy were closing in on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. And then, at 2:47 a.m., it happened. The bell above the door chimed. I froze, my hand hovering over a box of allergy medication. The sound was sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. My heart started pounding before I even turned around. Customers at this hour were rare, and after everything that had happened, I wasn't exactly eager to see who or what had walked in. I forced myself to move, stepping out of the aisle and toward the counter. That's when I saw him. He was standing just inside the door, silhouetted against the dim glow of the streetlights outside. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection in the glass. But then he stepped forward, and my blood ran cold. He was wearing my uniform, the same khaki pants, the same blue polo shirt with the Desert Bloom Pharmacy logo embroidered on the chest. Even the name tag pinned to his shirt was mine, Elias. But that wasn't the worst part. He had my face. It was like looking into a mirror, but wrong. His features were mine, down to the faint scar above my eyebrow from a childhood accident. But his expression, it was off. Too calm, too knowing. He smiled at me, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made my skin crawl. "You can go now," he said, his voice eerily familiar. "I'll take over." I didn't move. I couldn't. My brain was screaming at me to run, to get out, but my body was frozen in place. He took another step forward, and that's when I snapped out of it. I turned and bolted for the back room, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I slammed the door shut behind me and fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the bolt. Once it was secure, I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing. What the hell was that? Was I hallucinating? Had I finally lost it? I needed to see. I needed proof. I stumbled over to the security monitor and pulled up the feed for the front of the store. The screen flickered to life, showing the empty aisles and the deserted counter. There was no one there. No man in my uniform, no one with my face. Just the empty pharmacy, bathed in the cold, sterile light of the fluorescents. I stared at the screen, my chest heaving. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the stress was getting to me. But then I noticed something on the counter. The register was open, the drawer slightly ajar. I zoomed in on the screen, squinting at the tiny details. That's when I saw it. The receipt printer had spat out a slip of paper. I couldn't read the text from the monitor, but I didn't need to. The register's display was clear enough. Purchase, 1 replacement, no refunds. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My legs gave way and I sank to the floor, my back against the wall. My mind was a whirlwind of questions, but one thought kept rising to the surface. What had I just sold? And to whom? I stayed in the back room until the sun came up, too afraid to move, too afraid to even think. When my shift finally ended, I left the pharmacy in a daze. The image of that man, my face, my uniform, burned into my mind. I didn't know what was happening, but I was starting to realize that the rules weren't just there to protect me. They were there to protect them. And I was running out of time to figure out who or what they were. The nights at Desert Bloom Pharmacy were always quiet, but after the incident with the man who looked like me, the silence felt heavier, more oppressive. I found myself jumping at every sound, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. I was restocking shelves in aisle 7, the same aisle I had to check on the security feed at 3:17 a.m. when it happened. The lights flickered. It was subtle at first, just a quick dimming of the fluorescence overhead. I froze, my hand clutching a box of painkillers, and looked up. The lights steadied for a moment, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But then they flickered again, more violently this time, the bulbs buzzing and sputtering like they were about to give out. My mind raced back to Rule 4. If the lights flicker, hum a children's song until they stop. It seemed like such a bizarre rule, but after everything I'd seen, I wasn't about to ignore it. I started humming the first thing that came to mind. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. My voice was shaky at first, barely audible over the buzzing of the lights, but I forced myself to keep going. The flickering intensified. The lights dimmed almost completely, plunging the pharmacy into near darkness, then flared back to life with a harsh, blinding glare. I kept humming, my voice growing louder, more desperate. The air felt charged, like the static before a storm, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the flickering stopped. The lights stabilized, casting their usual cold, sterile glow over the pharmacy. I stopped humming, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The silence that followed was deafening. But it wasn't just silence, it was darkness. The lights hadn't just stabilized, they'd gone out completely. The pharmacy was plunged into pitch black, the kind of darkness that feels alive, like it's pressing in on you from all sides. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes strained to adjust, but there was nothing to see, just endless, suffocating black. And then I saw them. Shadows, faint at first, like wisps of smoke, but they grew more defined as I watched. They moved across the walls, twisting and writhing like dancers in some macabre performance. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but the shadows didn't disappear. If anything, they became more vivid, more real. I took a step back, my shoulder bumping into the shelf behind me. The sound seemed to echo in the darkness, and the shadows reacted, their movements becoming more frantic, more deliberate. I could almost make out shapes now, elongated figures with too many limbs, their forms shifting and merging in ways that made my stomach churn. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. The screen lit up, casting a weak glow around me, and I pointed it toward the walls. The shadows were gone. The pharmacy was just a pharmacy again, silent and still. But the feeling of being watched lingered. I stayed there for what felt like hours, clutching my phone like a lifeline, until the lights finally came back on. When they did, the pharmacy looked normal, shelves neatly stocked, aisles empty, the register silent. But I couldn't shake the image of those shadows twisting and dancing in the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the shadows, the figures, the endless, suffocating black. By this point, I was starting to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. But I couldn't quit. Not yet. I needed the job, needed the money. So I kept showing up, night after night, trying to convince myself that I could handle whatever the pharmacy threw at me. That's when I noticed the filing cabinet. It was a small, unassuming thing, tucked away in the corner of the back room. I'd never paid much attention to it before. It was just where we kept old prescriptions, the ones that hadn't been picked up or had been refilled too many times. But that night, something about it caught my eye. The top drawer was slightly ajar, just enough to make me wonder if I'd left it open the night before. I walked over and pulled the drawer open, expecting to see the usual mess of papers and folders. But what I found stopped me cold. The prescriptions were rearranged. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I'd just forgotten how they were organized. But no, they were definitely different. Instead of being sorted by last name like they always were, they were now arranged alphabetically by first name. I flipped through them, my fingers trembling slightly as I pulled out one file after another. Alice, Benjamin, Catherine. It was meticulous, almost obsessive in its precision. And then I saw it. Abernathy. The name jumped out at me like a slap to the face. I pulled the file out, my heart pounding. It was old, the edges of the paper yellowed and brittle. The prescription was handwritten in that same spidery ink I'd seen on the rules, and it was signed by Mr. Abernathy himself. But it wasn't for a customer. It was for him. I stared at the paper, my mind racing. Who was Abernathy? The previous pharmacist, sure, but that didn't explain why his name kept popping up, why his presence seemed to linger in every corner of this place. I flipped through the rest of the files, looking for more clues, but there was nothing. Just that one prescription, sitting there like a taunt. I closed the drawer and leaned against the cabinet, trying to steady my breathing. The back room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in around me. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerators, the ticking of the clock on the wall, but underneath it all was something else. A low, almost imperceptible whisper, like the building itself was trying to tell me something. I didn't sleep that night also. My mind kept going back to the filing cabinet, to the name Abernathy. Who was he? What had happened to him? And why did it feel like he was still here, watching, waiting? Every night at the pharmacy felt like walking through a minefield, waiting for the next rule to kick in, the next incident to unfold. But that night was different. It started like any other. I was sitting in the back room, the glow of the security monitor casting eerie shadows on the walls. The clock on the wall ticked closer to 3:17 a.m., and I felt that familiar knot of dread in my stomach. I pulled up the feed for aisle 7, expecting the usual nothingness. At first it looked the same. The aisle was empty, the shelves neatly stocked, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. But then I noticed something. A bottle of cough syrup on the middle shelf had moved, just an inch or so to the left. It was such a small change that I almost missed it, but once I saw it, I couldn't look away. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding. The bottle was definitely out of place. I rewound the footage, watching the timestamp tick backward. The bottle shifted again, this time to the right, as if it was being nudged by an invisible hand. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't possible. There was no one in the aisle, no one on the feed, just the bottle, moving on its own. I kept watching, my eyes glued to the screen. The footage played forward again, and this time I saw it. Something on the metal shelf behind the bottle caught the light, a series of faint scratches, almost imperceptible. I zoomed in, my hands trembling as I adjusted the controls. The scratches weren't random, they were deliberate, forming patterns, shapes. And then I saw him, Mr. Abernathy's face. It was faint, almost like a trick of the light, but it was there. His features were etched into the metal, his eyes wide and pleading, his mouth open as if he was trying to speak. I recoiled from the screen, my heart racing. This wasn't possible, it couldn't be. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. He was trying to tell me something. I grabbed a pen and a scrap of paper, my hands shaking as I tried to transcribe the scratches. They weren't just random marks, they were a code. It took me a while to recognize it, but once I did, it clicked. Pigpen cipher. I'd seen it before, years ago, in some old book about secret codes. It was simple but effective. Each symbol represented a letter. I worked slowly, painstakingly translating each symbol. My hands were slick with sweat, and I had to keep wiping them on my pants to keep the pen from slipping. The back room was silent except for the sound of my breathing and the faint hum of the monitor. The clock on the wall ticked away, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was the message, the scratches, Abernathy's face. Finally, I had it. The message read, "The patients aren't sick, they are offerings." I stared at the words, my mind racing. Offerings? What did that mean? My stomach churned as the pieces started to fall into place. The rules, the incidents, the shadows, it was all connected. The pharmacy wasn't just a place to fill prescriptions. It was something else, something darker. I thought about the man who'd come in asking for Abernathy's special, the way his voice had deepened, the way he'd lunged at me. I thought about the sleeping pills, the overdose, the crushed pill on the floor. And I thought about the shadows, twisting and dancing in the dark. The patients weren't sick, they were offerings, but to whom? And for what? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. The pharmacy wasn't just a job, it was a trap. And if I didn't get out soon, I'd be the next offering. The message on the shelf, "The patients aren't sick, they are offerings," haunted me. It was all I could think about. Every time I filled a prescription, every time I handed a bottle of pills to a customer, I wondered, are they one of them? Are they an offering? But the question that gnawed at me the most was about Abernathy's special. Rule 6 was clear. If a customer asks for Abernathy's special, say it's out of stock and offer an alternative. But why? What was it? And why did it feel like the key to everything? I had to know. Desperation and disgust for my job pushed me to break the rule. I waited until the pharmacy was empty, the silence pressing in around me like a weight. The old computer in the back room was ancient, its screen flickering faintly as I booted it up. The system was slow, the files disorganized, but I eventually found what I was looking for. The prescription for Abernathy's special. It was for a man named John. The prescription was handwritten, the ink faded but still legible. It stated that John could have the prescription refilled at any time, but it must be filled by Abernathy. No one else. My stomach churned as I read the details. What was so special about this prescription that only Abernathy could fill it? And why was it still in the system if Abernathy was gone? I didn't have to wait long to find out. A few nights later, the bell above the door chimed, pulling me out of my thoughts. I looked up and saw him, a man, gaunt and pale, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were sunken, hollow, like they'd been sucked back into his skull. He shuffled toward the counter, his movements slow and deliberate, and leaned heavily on the glass. "Abernathy's special," he said, his voice raspy and low. "I need it." My gut twisted. I could feel the weight of Rule 6 pressing down on me, but I couldn't look away from him. There was something wrong with him, something deeply wrong. His eyes were too dark, too empty, and when he spoke, his breath smelled like decay. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "We're out of stock, but I can offer you an alternative." "No." His voice cut through the air like a knife, sharp and final. "Abernathy promised. I need it." I froze. His voice had changed, deepened, becoming something inhuman. It was like hearing two voices at once, one human, one not. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I couldn't do this. I couldn't give him whatever this special was, but I also couldn't just turn him away, not with the way he was looking at me. I'll see what I can do," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. I turned and hurried to the back room, my heart pounding. I didn't even pretend to check the stock. Instead, I went straight to Abernathy's old files, the ones I'd found on the computer. I rifled through them, my hands trembling as I pulled out notes, logs, anything that might tell me what Abernathy's special was. And then I found it. The ingredients were listed in Abernathy's spidery handwriting: rare herbs, synthesized chemicals, and ground human bone. My stomach turned as I read the details. It was a concoction designed to prolong life, but at a horrific cost. The notes were filled with references to vitality transfer and sustained essence. It didn't take long for me to piece it together. The patients weren't sick, they were offerings. Their vitality, their life force, was being drained to keep this man, John, alive and healthy. Abernathy's special wasn't medicine, it was poison. And I was supposed to be the one administering it. I felt sick. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers. The back room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in around me. I could hear the man out front, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he paced the aisles, waiting, watching. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't give him the special. I couldn't be a part of this. But I also couldn't just walk away. Not yet. Not until I knew how to stop it. I stood in the back room, clutching Abernathy's notes in my trembling hands, my mind racing. The man, John, was still out there, pacing the aisles, waiting for his special. I could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, each one echoing like a drumbeat in the silence of the pharmacy. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my hands were slick with sweat. I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing: I couldn't give him what he wanted. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and stepped out of the back room. The pharmacy was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. John was standing at the counter, his gaunt frame silhouetted against the dim glow of the streetlights outside. He turned to face me, his sunken eyes locking onto mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Well," he croaked, his voice low and raspy. "Do you have it?" I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. "No," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't have it, and I'm not going to give it to you." His face contorted in rage, his features twisting into something inhuman. His eyes darkened, his mouth stretching into a grotesque snarl. "Abernathy promised," he hissed, his voice deepening, becoming guttural, almost animalistic. "I need it." I slammed my fist down on the counter, the sound echoing through the empty pharmacy. "Get out!" I screamed, my voice raw with fear and anger. "Get out of here!" He lunged at me, his movements unnaturally fast, his hands clawing at the air. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a bottle of industrial-strength disinfectant. Without thinking, I sprayed it directly into his face. He let out a scream, a sound so unearthly it made my blood run cold. He stumbled back, clutching his eyes, his body writhing in pain. And then, just like that, he was gone. Vanished. The pharmacy was silent again, the only sound the faint hum of the lights and the pounding of my heart. I stood there for a moment, my chest heaving, the bottle of disinfectant still clutched in my hand. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: fear, relief, disbelief. But I didn't have time to process any of it. I knew I had to get out of there. Now. I grabbed a piece of paper and scrawled a note to Miss Hoover, my hands shaking so badly I could barely write. I told her everything: what I'd found, what I'd seen, what I'd done. I warned her to get out, to leave the pharmacy and never look back. I didn't know if she'd listen, but I had to try. I left the note on the counter, grabbed my things, and walked out the door. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying everything that had happened over and over again. When I got home, I packed my bags and left Nevada that same night. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just disappeared. I never went back. Not to the pharmacy, not to Nevada. But I still have nightmares. I see aisle 7, the shadows twisting and dancing on the walls. I see the faces, John's, Abernathy's, the man who looked like me. And I hear the screams, the unearthly, inhuman screams that still haunt me. The gas station fire, the overdose, the shadows, they were all connected. That pharmacy wasn't just a business, it was a feeding ground. And I, Elias, was almost part of the menu. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more creepy stories. Stay safe, and see you in the next nightmare.